Welcome to the second part of our inflation series. This video talks about inflation measurement. So first of all, we need to understand why we need to measure inflation in the first place. Like we saw in the part 1 of the inflation series, inflation has a lot of effects, especially adverse effects on the people. So to understand what they are going through, we need to understand what is the inflation. Secondly, when the GDP of a country changes, GDP is basically the value of all the goods and services produced in the economy in a particular year. Now the value of goods and services comprises of two things. First is the change in quantity and second is the change in price. So when you multiply both of those, you get the value. Now let us say in an economy in 1 year only cars were produced, 100 cars were produced and the price of each car was rupees 2. So effectively the GDP becomes 200, 100 into 2. Now in the next year, let us say the quantity of the cars remains absolutely the same, which is 100, but the price of the car increases to rupees 4. So the value of goods becomes 400. So effectively you can see that there has been a 100% increase in the GDP, but really the people don't get anything extra because they still have 100 cars as they had in the previous year. So what we need to do is to remove the impact of price changes from the GDP to get to know the real GDP and how the real performance of the economy is. So for that again, we need to deflate the nominal GDP, that is the GDP including the prices, by the inflation. So we need to measure the inflation. The government undertakes a lot of fiscal and monetary interventions to improve the state of the economy or to control inflation, and all those interventions again depend on what the inflation number is right now. So for that we need to measure inflation. Also, we learn about WPI and CPI, which actually show you the effects on the supply chain. So how are the wholesalers getting impacted? How are the consumers getting impacted? So to understand that also, we need various measures of inflation. How is it measured? There are three primary kinds of inflation indices. First is the wholesale price index, then the consumer price index, and now a very recent phenomena is the producer price index. So first let us understand how any index is measured. Inflation index, any of these, this is a basic concept valid on all the inflation indices. First of all, you choose a base year. In the base year, you need to make a consumption basket. A basket of all the goods or services or whatever which the people are using in the country. So you create, let us say for example, I choose 1990 as my base year. And I say that okay, in 1990 an average consumption basket would include, let us say, 3 cars or 5 loaves of bread, whatever. So I create a basket. Now the prices of all those things will give me the value of that consumption basket in that base year. Now each year going forward, the prices will change. Now what we do is we assume that in the consumption basket the quantity remains exactly the same and the consumption basket of the people is not changing. That is an assumption. So let us say in the base year the value of my entire basket was rupees 100. In the next year the value of the same quantity of things that are there in the basket, so again the same 3 cars and 2 loaves of breads now cost, let us say, rupees 115. So the change in the prices in the economy are considered to be 15%. So the price index has changed by 15%. That is how any index generally is measured. Now let us go into specific details. Wholesale price index. Wholesale price index is basically change in the average wholesale prices. So wholesale is different from retail. Retail is where the normal consumers like you and me go and buy stuff. But wholesaler is an intermediary stage. So a person who buys directly from the, let us say there are farmers who are producing wheat. So a wholesaler will buy wheat or bananas or anything from the producers in wholesale, in bulk. And then they sell it to various retailers. So the normal retail, the sabzi wala or the phal wala, you go to are retailers, and in between is a wholesaler. So when we track price changes at the wholesaler level, so change in the wholesaler price levels year on year is the wholesale price index. This was first published in 1942, and earlier the base year, like I talked about earlier, was 1993-94. But in 2010, because see, the basket obviously over the years will become very outdated. Like in 93-94, computers, for instance, were not really part of anyone's consumption basket, so they had a very less weight in the basket, if at all. Similarly, smartphones, which are now ubiquitous, at that time did not even exist. So there are new things which keep coming in the economy which need to be taken into account. So periodically the base year needs to be changed, and effectively the basket needs to be changed. So in 2010, the base year for the wholesale price index was changed from 93-94 to 2004-2005. Also, the items were increased to 676 items. So, but one problem with wholesale price index is it does not include services, because services are not something that gets traded in that wholesaler retailer value chain. So this was a basic measure of inflation. Now, what are the problems with WPI? Like I said, services are not included in WPI, and they are 55% of our economy. So if you're using a measure of inflation which leaves out 55% of the economy, then you can imagine that it is not very reflective of what prices people are really paying in the economy. So let us say we don't get to know that people need to pay a lot more now for tourism services or conveyance or your domestic help or anything. So because these are all services, or restaurants, so these things are not getting reflected in WPI. So this was a major issue. Secondly, wholesaler is really an intermediary stage. It is not the producer, it is not the consumer. So it's somewhere in between, and again it's therefore not very reflective of what the economy as a whole is going through. So the wholesalers have a totally different set of issues than, like, say, the consumer and the producer. Because of which, the third point, the business impact cannot be really very well measured by WPI. Because as I said, they're really an intermediary. The value they're adding is of a very specific kind, let's say the storage and the transportation kind of value they're adding, but they're not really producing the products, nor are they consuming the products. Hence, we come on to the consumer price index. The CPI is again the average price change of consumer goods and services produced by households. The first change here you see is services. So the CPI consumption basket of the base year will include services. It is more acceptable as a barometer of inflation, and hence it's used as a tool for monitoring price stability. And like I told you, a deflator in national accounts. So once you get the GDP nominal, to get the real growth in GDP, you tend to use CPI. Now, CPI are of different kinds. On the left, you can see our occupation specific and center specific CPI. This is what was prevalent in India till a while ago. So we used to have a CPI rural labor, CPI industrial worker, CPI agricultural labor, which meant we had three baskets. One which represented the rural labor. So what is the rural labor consuming in a typical basket? Second was industrial worker. What a typical industrial worker is consuming, and agricultural labor similarly. And we used to track price changes in these baskets to get these CPI figures. This was done by the Labor Bureau. But then we thought that we are fragmenting it a bit too much. So if we do it like this, then we don't get a very coherent measure of inflation for the entire economy. So because of which, we went to the right side, which is the broader coverage, where we said we'll have a rural basket and an urban basket, and we'll track price changes in these to get a rural CPI and an urban CPI. This was to be done by CSO, this whole thing, and Urjit Patel committee recommended this as a new CPI combined. So you combine the rural and urban as a key measure of inflation. So a few months back, RBI moved from the previous measures of CPI to this rural and urban combined CPI measured by CSO as the measure of inflation in the economy. Now, you might have heard about the producer price index. This is another new thing, and let's understand what this animal is all about. So PPI, first of all, is tracking prices at the producer level. So we saw the wholesaler level, which was the intermediary stage, the consumer level, which is the final stage. But now we're trying to see what are the prices when they are first produced of any good and services. So if you see these features of PPI, first of all, it gives you a wider coverage of products and services. Secondly, it tracks pure price changes. So what this means is if a producer is producing something, at that point, that is the first commercial transaction. So it lacks tax and tax fluctuations. It also removes effects of transportation, storage. So when, let us say, we have a producer of wheat, so he is producing wheat. Now when we track the PPI, we will find out how the feed prices at that stage are changing. which would include effects like climate. So if the climate goes bad, the wheat price increases, or that will include stuff like drought and those kind of things. So how the producer is getting impacted. But as we move away from the producer, there are various external effects which start impacting the price. So the producer, after producing his wheat, is going to transport it to the wholesaler. Now the transportation, for some reason, price might get fluctuated. So now the wholesaler price will increase. But that is not really indicative of the economy as such. That is indicative of a particular thing, which is transportation. But your WPI will get impacted by that. Similarly, at every transaction, there are tax effects. So when the producer is selling it to the wholesaler, or the wholesaler is selling it to the consumer, at a very general level, you can understand that there would be taxes which the government imposes, and the tax rates can keep changing. So again, when you measure the prices at a later stage, the tax effects will also tend to vary the prices. So because of these things, the PPI is considered to be a more pure form of measuring inflation, and most major economies use this. So now there has been a recent move by the government to move towards this measure, but it hasn't been really adopted at a full scale till now. Why hasn't it been still adopted, and what are the challenges which PPI faces? First of all, service sector data is difficult to come by. There is no real measure or a database for services sector data. Secondly, a lot of the transactions at the producer to wholesaler level happens in mandis. Now again, there is no real database of these mandis, and tracking these mandi transactions is again very difficult. Also, the wholesaler price indices and the CPIs have been there in the country for a while now, so we have a lot of historical data for comparison. But PPIs do not have obviously any historical data. So if I start tracking PPI from today onwards, I will not know okay, so if today I get a PPI change of, let us say, I say PPI inflation is 10%, I do not know what this number means. What was the PPI from 2004 to 2005 or anything? I have nothing to compare it by. But anyways, the government is trying to overcome these difficulties, and according to Goldar committee, it is still in the process of formulating the PPI to make PPI the final measure of inflation in the economy. Okay, we come to the final concept of core inflation. In the news, you might have heard a lot about core inflation, so I just want to give you very briefly what core inflation really means. Headline inflation is any inflation that we talk about. So your CPI can be headline inflation, your WPI, PPI, anything can be headline inflation. Headline inflation is basically the one number of inflation which is calculated in the economy. But this includes food, obviously, and energy prices. Now, food and energy prices have a peculiar property of being very, very prone to shocks. So there could be a food price shock, like oil prices especially, you might have seen, are prone to various shocks. So if there is a Gulf war, the oil prices will suddenly shoot up. Or like recently, there is another video in our series which talks about why oil prices have been falling. They fell from a peak of 114 to 52 now within a span of months. So because of which the inflation number keeps getting very, very jittery. It keeps moving a lot. So because of which you can't track what is happening in the economy. So to remove this problem, a measure of inflation known as core inflation is used, where from the headline inflation you remove the effect of food and energy prices. So then you can see more clearly what is happening in the economy. So what are the underlying forces which are moving the economy. Now RBI earlier used to use WPI as the headline inflation, and now has moved to CPI, like we talked about earlier. And now, like when PPI comes on in a full way, then headline inflation measure would become PPI. So again, from PPI, when we remove food and energy prices, we would get the core inflation, which can be used to implement various monetary and fiscal policies, and basically to track inflation in the economy and the underlying economic forces. So with this, I would like to finish this video, the small conceptual video about measuring inflation. Thank you for watching. Hope you liked the video. Comments and suggestions are welcome. Thank you.